The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned not with a shattering explosion in the quiet waters of Pearl Harbor, but with a continued, tense silence across the Pacific. In this alternate timeline, the war councils in Tokyo have reached a different conclusion. The voices of caution, those who viewed the Southern strategy, the seizure of the oil-rich Dutch East Indies and British Malaya, as a risky but manageable venture, have won out over Admiral Yamamoto's dire warning that a failure to cripple the American Pacific Fleet would lead to a protracted war Japan could not win. The First Air Fleet never turns east. Instead, it provides distant cover as a vast invasion force descends upon Southeast Asia. The question that has echoed through history is changed, not where is the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but what now? The United States, a nation profoundly divided between isolationist sentiment and a growing, uneasy sense of global threat, awakens to news not of an attack on its own soil, but of a blatant, aggressive imperial conquest by Japan. The path forward is shrouded not in the clear, unifying fog of war, but in the murky and contentious realm of geopolitics, national interest, and a public deeply weary of foreign entanglements. President Franklin D. Roosevelt would have been faced with a crisis of a fundamentally different character. The Day of Infamy speech is never written. Instead, he must go before Congress and the American people to decry an aggression that, while horrifying, did not directly target American citizens or territory. The U.S. had already imposed a crippling oil embargo on Japan and frozen its assets, actions which historians agree made war highly probable. But probability is not certainty, and without the catalyst of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's hands are tied by political reality. The powerful America First Committee, with its charismatic spokesman Charles Lindbergh, would have roared back to life, arguing that Japan's war in Asia was none of America's business, a continuation of a colonial struggle that the U.S. should wisely avoid. The loss of life at Pearl Harbor, the sunken battleships, the very image of American vulnerability, these were the elements that forged an almost instant and unanimous will to fight. Without them, Roosevelt would be leading a fractured nation. He would push for a declaration of war, certainly, but its passage through Congress would be far from guaranteed. A protracted and bitter debate would ensue, eating up precious weeks or even months, while Japanese forces solidified their new Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Militarily, the immediate landscape is transformed. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, with its battleships, aircraft carriers, and infrastructure intact, is not a wounded giant, but a poised, if not yet fully mobilized, force. Admiral Kimmel and General Short remain in command at Pearl Harbor, their commands on high alert due to the hostilities in the Pacific, but not recovering from a devastating surprise attack. The strategic imperative, however, is unclear. Does the U.S. Navy sortie immediately to challenge the Japanese invasions thousands of miles away in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies? Such a move would be precisely the kind of dramatic fleet versus fleet engagement Yamamoto had hoped to provoke and win with his Pearl Harbor plan. The American public, without the burning desire for revenge, might have little stomach for news of major naval losses suffered in defense of European colonies. The early campaign would likely be one of cautious reinforcement of the Philippines and Guam, and a focus on protecting the sea lanes to Australia, now a crucial Allied frontline base. The fate of the Philippines becomes an even more tragic and drawn-out saga. In our history, the Japanese attack on the islands began just hours after Pearl Harbor, and General MacArthur's forces, caught unprepared, fought a doomed but heroic delaying action. In this timeline, the Philippines is still a prime target for Japan, as its strategic position threatens the sea lanes from the resource-rich south. The attack would proceed, but perhaps not with the same overwhelming initial intensity, as Japanese air and naval assets are not freed from the Pearl Harbor operation. Crucially, however, the American political will for a massive, immediate relief effort to the Philippines is absent.
The public and congressional focus would be on why are our boys dying for a distant colony rather than remember Pearl Harbor. The siege of Bataan and Corregidor might last longer, but the eventual fall would be seen not as a tragic chapter following a national attack, but as a painful symptom of an unpopular, far-off war. MacArthur's evacuation to Australia and his famous "I shall return" pledge might be met with more skepticism than resolve back home. In this alternate 1942, the Germany First policy agreed upon by Roosevelt and Churchill in the ABC-1 conferences faces its greatest test. In our reality, even after the outrage of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military had to uphold this priority against public pressure to avenge Japan first. Without Pearl Harbor, that pressure is negligible. The entire weight of American anger, what little there is directed at Japan. The thought of sending vast armies and materiel to Britain and North Africa while American troops are under siege in the Pacific would be politically toxic. Roosevelt would be forced to appease public and congressional opinion by allocating a far greater proportion of resources to the Pacific theater in 1942 and likely 1943. This has a cascading effect on the war in Europe. The North African campaign, Operation Torch, might be delayed or scaled down. The buildup in Britain for the eventual invasion of Normandy would be slower. The Red Army, bearing the brunt of the German war machine, would plead even more desperately for a second front that the Americans are less equipped and politically willing to open. The Anglo-American alliance would be strained, with Churchill living in dread that American attention might swing entirely away from the Nazi threat. The most profound and chilling consequence, however, might lie in the development and use of the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project was born out of a fear that the Nazi Germany might develop such a weapon first. Its colossal expense was justified by the totality of the war. In a United States less unified, fighting a war that a significant portion of its population saw as optional or misguided, would Congress have continued to authorize virtually unlimited, secret funds for this speculative weapon? The project might have proceeded, but at a slower pace, with more bureaucratic scrutiny. And furthermore, the moral calculus for using such a horrific weapon changes dramatically. In our history, the bomb was dropped to avoid an invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation predicted to cost 1 million American casualties and countless Japanese lives. This grim justification was underpinned by the national memory of Pearl Harbor, the Bataan Death March, and years of brutal island fighting. In a war that began less viscerally for America against an enemy that had not directly struck the homeland, would President Truman, or perhaps a president who never succeeded Roosevelt if the war's course altered politics, have ordered the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? The decision might have been postponed, debated, or even deemed politically unpalatable. The war in the Pacific could have ended with a conventional invasion, a blockade-induced starvation, or a negotiated peace with a still powerful Japanese military establishment, leaving the emperor's militarist system perhaps intact. Ultimately, a world where Japan never attacked Pearl Harbor is a world where the United States enters the Second World War as a reluctant great power, not a vengeful, awakened giant. The conflict becomes more clearly a two-theater war with competing priorities rather than a unified global crusade. The moral clarity that came from being the victim of a surprise attack is replaced by the ambiguous, hard realities of realpolitik. The war likely lasts longer. The Soviet Union, bearing even more of the burden in Europe, might push deeper into a more devastated Central Europe. The post-war order, built so decisively on American economic and military dominance, would look different, perhaps more fractured, with a less thoroughly defeated Japan and a more influential, exhausted USSR. The greatest generation would still fight and win, but their home front would be divided, their purpose questioned, and their victory less definitive. The echo of that quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii would not be one of infamy, but of a road not taken, a path leading to a longer, darker, and even more complicated 20th century. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a catastrophe, but it also provided a terrible, unifying simplicity. Without it, America and the world would have been forced to navigate the war's profound complexities without that cruel, clarifying light.